Today we are talking with John Wilkman, the author of Floodpath, the deadliest man-made disaster of 20th century America and the making of modern Los Angeles. Welcome to Redera.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. You have done enormous amount of work, and there's a lot of meticulous research that has gone into in putting the book together. Can you give us a little bit of overview of what the central theme or the main point about the topic that you are writing in this book on Floodpath?
Well, what attracted me to the story in the first place was this is the worst civil engineering failure of the 20th century in the United States, and virtually no one knows about it. And so the story was attractive for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, what really happened. That's somewhat of a mystery. And more than that, why isn't it better known? So one of the things I try to do in the book is to really get across the point that the way history is written isn't as totally objective. And many times we find that aspects of the past get overlooked or are not taken seriously or just are misplaced. And particularly in the case of the American West, and in particular the large urban West cities like Los Angeles, one of the things that always sort of concerned me about the history of America is that it's very much viewed from an East Coast point of view. And often as you get farther west, more and more the history gets simplified. So, for example, the history of California, until fairly recently, was basically considered the gold rush, maybe the earthquake in San Francisco. And as far as Los Angeles is concerned, it really was the rise of Hollywood. And in fact, the history of the West, and particularly of the urban West, San Francisco, and even more so Los Angeles, I found fascinating and really overlooked, and has a great deal to say about how America developed, and more so how the future of this country might be going. So when I discovered the story of Floodpath, which takes place in 1928, I realized that although this was a story of some time ago, it really has a striking relevance to what's going on in America right now when we have our concerns about water resources, infrastructure, all those issues that we're dealing with now. We can really learn from this very little-known story from 1928.
Very well said. So what went wrong in the St. Francis Dam?
A number of things went wrong. Basically, Los Angeles grew up in a rush. It was probably perhaps the fastest growing major city in the United States, and possibly in the context of the world. For a period of time, beginning in the 1880s and 90s, it was doubling and doubling again. The population again and again was doubling. And essentially, Los Angeles was a very unusual city because normally a great city has natural benefits that are there. It's usually near a large river, or it's got a natural port, or it has access, trade route access. And Los Angeles really had none of these natural benefits. But in a very striking way, and in a very American way, the city really sort of built itself. It was a man-made city. There was no port here, so they got together and dredged a harbor and made a port now, which is considered the busiest in the United States, from essentially just mud flats. And when it came to water to support the growth of the city, the only really source initially was not very much rainfall compared to big cities like New York or Chicago or even San Francisco, and a river which wasn't a huge source of water either, and it wasn't navigable. You couldn't really do trade and transportation on it. So what the city had to do was to reach out to bring water from distant sources, and that's what they did. And it built one of the most remarkable, and probably it is still to this day the largest municipal water system in the United States. It brought water from 233 miles away, carried by gravity alone, to Los Angeles. So Los Angeles was in a hurry. It was in a hurry to grow. It was growing. It needed to be able to support that economically with a port. It needed to support the life that it needed to grow with water. And in this race against the future, in the context of this, the St. Francis Dam was constructed. And it was meant basically to be a resource to hold the supply of water that the city needed when the snows from the 200 miles away weren't enough. And the city had grown so fast that the man who was constructing this dam, again, a man named William Mulholland, who had really started to come to the city in 1878. He was 72 years old. He had built the great aqueduct. The great triumph of his career was the building of the aqueduct that brought the water to Los Angeles. Without that aqueduct, there'd be no Los Angeles, really, no modern Los Angeles. So this is a man who was an icon, whose decisions were never challenged, and everybody was in a hurry, and including William Mulholland. So the dam was built on a location that was not particularly well suited for a large dam, and that contributed to the failure.
Obviously, it was the second largest disaster in the U.S., and also there were many engineering issues involved as well. Would you give us a little bit more context at the time? Los Angeles was in a hurry, and why it was growing so rapidly at that time? What was driving the growth?
Well, the city was isolated up until 1876, when the Transcontinental Railroad came across the country. And the country wanted to expand, and the government was interested in developing the western side of the country in relation to trade. And also, Los Angeles was blessed with this incredible climate and very rich agricultural environment. So it became a hugely appealing place for people to come who wanted to start afresh, who wanted to benefit from the healthy climate. For a while, it was a place, if you had tuberculosis or lung disease or whatever in the 1870s, you would come to Los Angeles. And San Francisco had its gold rush. Los Angeles had its sick rush. Sick people came here to get better, and many of them did. And then entrepreneurs who were looking for a fertile, fresh ground to start businesses and to grow, particularly initially in agriculture, and then later with the discovery of oil and the oil business, this became a very attractive place for people to come and wanting to start. And so Los Angeles really was this hugely, rapidly growing place. And it brought people who, like immigrants who had come from Europe and other places in Asia to the United States, it brought people who were willing to start again or looking for new ways to do things, who were excited about the possibilities of the future. So that LA was very much a city of the future. And it never really seemed to be concerned that much with the past and, certainly with the present. But it was very future oriented. And so the technology of dams was one of the new developing powers during the 1920s, particularly in the American West. And great dams were being built and waterworks were being built, and they would climax with this enormous growth in the 1930s and 40s. And the St. Francis Dam was built in 1928, just as Hoover Dam in Colorado was going through a very troubling, difficult time to get through Congress. So the technology was poised in the nation to apply this new dam and hydraulic civil engineering to transform this whole half of the United States, and actually even more than that, almost all of the United States. So it was a critical time, technically and engineering-wise, for this failure to take place.
Yeah, you have a very nice quote in the book that I remember. It says, unlike the visual drama of a great bridge, most dams are stolid. And almost close to 84,000 dams across the country, but people appreciate more a bridge than a dam, and dams are very solid structures as well.
Oh, yeah, well, dams, of course, really are the foundation of civilization. They go back thousands of years to the ancient Mesopotamia and the river complexes in the Middle East, and that's how civilizations really began, because once you could control the water supply, you could irrigate crops, you could preserve water for periods of time when there wasn't enough, so you could have a city, people could live together in large places. So dams were just essential to the ancient development of civilization in the world. And in Los Angeles, because of the conditions we had, they were essential to the creation of what is now the second largest city in the United States. And so dams are all through the country. You would think, oh, gee, most of them are, in the West where it's dry. No, dams are all the way through the country. And in fact, I mentioned in the book, the city of New York, by the 1840s, had polluted enough of the Hudson River, so they had to turn to distant water sources, and they built the Croton Dam and Reservoir 20 miles north of the city, which is still there and still part of the water system for New York. So cities really needed this water engineering, this hydraulic engineering to survive and to grow, and none more so than Los Angeles.
And obviously, we have a far more sobering assessment of our infrastructure of the dams across the country from the American Society of Civil Engineering. And if you want to kind of highlight that, there are a large number of dams that don't even have emergency activation plans.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the St. Francis Dam collapsed after being constructed 2 years after its construction. The cause of the failure, as I mentioned, was basically the site for the dam was not an adequate site for a large concrete dam. The problem we face now is we have perfectly engineered structured dams, and they've lasted for 50 or more years. Well, that's the issue. If they're not being maintained after 50 years, well, inevitably, no matter how well constructed and planned and built they were, an aging dam becomes a possible problem. And what we've been doing now, essentially, is we're not putting the money into the infrastructure. So there are 84,000 dams in the United States right now, roughly, more than that now, I would expect. More than 4,000 of them were deemed by the American Society of Civil Engineers as vulnerable to failure. And of those that were possible failures, only a little more than half had any kind of emergency action plan. So we've been putting off a disaster when it comes to our infrastructure in all kinds of ways, the highways and roads and bridges, but dams in particular, particularly large ones, can be enormously destructive if they fail. So that's what makes the connection with this dam collapse of 1928 so relevant today. It's not because of faulty planning or faulty design. It's that we have not maintained the dams that we have right now that have lasted, and they're over 50 years old.
Mm-hmm. You know, you went through a lot of detailed work when putting the book together, researching a lot of historical data, also interviewing a lot of eyewitness accounts, and also poring over and understanding a lot of engineering documents that were discovered later on. Would you explain some of the eyewitness accounts that were kind of very touching and illuminating as well?
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'll go back a little bit how I got into doing this book and why I wanted to do it and how I proceeded to develop it. I grew up in Los Angeles and not too far from the site of the St. Francis Dam. And during my upbringing in school, like every other kid in Los Angeles, we never were taught anything about the St. Francis Dam. I never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. It was just not in the history books. So where history was for the classes that I took, it was all on the East Coast. That's where American history is. That's where it lived. That's where American culture was. The Los Angeles was considered this great wasteland. It's just this trivial world of tinsel and the movies and all that. So like any smart kid, the first thing I wanted to do was to go east where the action was. So when I finally had a chance I went to New York after graduating from college in the Midwest, and then headed to New York, where I began my career as a documentary filmmaker. And had a wonderful 14, 15 years in New York, enjoyed it very much and learned a lot, and found myself thinking more and more about Los Angeles. And so I decided to return to Los Angeles and continue my career here. And when I returned, I was stunned about really how I began to rediscover the city, and I began to figure, wow, this is not the image that I've had and many people have. This is a fascinating place. It has a very rich and complex history, far beyond Hollywood. So I began to research it, and I began to work on a documentary series, the first done in Los Angeles, called the Los Angeles History Project. And in the process of researching, I found a book by a man named Charles Outland. It had been published in 1963. And he tells the story of the St. Francis Dam disaster. And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, because I had no idea. I would ask people, oh my God, I've been in New York, so maybe I didn't know about it. Do you know about the St. Francis Dam? No one knew what it was. And it was just an astonishing story. So I began to research it. And in between other projects, and the first thing I began to realize is, of course, this took place a long time ago. I better talk to people who are now getting very old, who are not going to be around to tell me their stories. So I got a small grant from the California Humanities Council, and I went around with my video camera and a crew, and we interviewed 20 eyewitnesses and survivors. Many of them in their 70s and 80s. Some of them were kids at the time, and collected at least 25 or 30 hours of interviews with these people. And that becomes, in many ways, the core of the book because their voices are so essential to the storytelling. So I began to work on a documentary on the subject. And as I began to work on the documentary, I began to go into the files and the archives and all of that. And what really was holding things up was there was one critical document that I thought that Outland had. He seemed to refer to it, and it's the transcripts of the coroner's inquest, which was held after the failure to determine the guilt or the possible indictment of any parties for the failure. And no one knew where it was. We searched high and low through all kinds of archives. And one day my wife and partner Nancy, who was researching at the Huntington Library, came back and said, I found it. 800 pages of dialogue, again, people testifying what they saw, engineers speculating what had happened. So with that, I knew I had the core of what I was going to do. But meanwhile, many years had passed, and in many ways it was fortunate because another real problem was that a lot of the internal files of the Department of Water and Power, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, that built the aqueduct, had not been accessible, easily accessible to outside researchers, not because they were hiding anything, but they were certainly not making it easy, but it hadn't been well organized. And during the time that from the time I first discovered the story till the time that I began to think about writing it, a archivist had been hired, and he was going through the process of organizing these files for the first time. And I began to have access to stuff that no one had ever seen: internal documents, letters, memos, reports, all kinds of things that if I had tried to write the book or done the documentary 10 years before, I wouldn't have had. And that, of course, also enriched the subject enormously and made it really able to talk in a way that no one really, even Charles Outland, who had done his book in '63, didn't have access to this material. So with these documents and these interviews and these years of research into the files and all that stuff, we compiled huge drawers full, cabinets full of documents and research. And thank God for computers, they all could be then indexed and looked at so we could get at them very quickly. So when my wife, unfortunately, when she passed away in 2012, after all these many years of us working on it, I said to myself, I think I need to get this book done. And so I began seriously working on it in 2013. It took me about a year to write, and it came out in 2015. So it's a long, long process. But the main thing I wanted to do in telling the story, which is inspired by these interviews, is I wanted to do a kind of history that's becoming more popular now. The traditional history is a kind of a laying out of the facts in a clear and organized way. And there's a new school of history. David McCulloch is an example of that are just as accurate, just as academically sound on what they're doing. But they write as storytellers. They write in a narrative style. And I wanted to tell my story in that way. I wanted it to read like a novel, but everything in it is factual, including the words people say, everything that's there based on this huge amount of research that I had done. So my goal was to take people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in engineering or wouldn't be even interested in history, but are interested in good stories. And they would be the audience. And so that was who I was reaching for. I was reaching for this audience who just likes a good story. Because what it was, it's sort of social and political and technical history, that's for sure. But it's this detective story as well. And it's this incredible courtroom drama as they begin to find out who was guilty for all this stuff. So it all has all the components of a novel, but it really is solidly based on fact.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that context. That was so necessary and so helpful. Would you explain that, I think in the book, you explain a little bit that the cities thrive and survive on the rainfall and how important it is, the amount of rainfall compared to New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and where Los Angeles is lacking. And that's why the water became a very big, important commodity, which is obviously, that's what the city planners were driving to get the water from anywhere they can. And I think you mentioned in the book that Los Angeles gets almost half of the rainfall that the New York gets.
Oh, yeah. No, even far less than San Francisco as well. I mean, I think that what makes Los Angeles historically an interesting city is it really is a city based on innovation and on technology. I mean, there's so little natural resources aside from sunshine and good weather that were there that attracted people to come to California and to come to Los Angeles. But the other aspects of a modern city, the people that Los Angeles had to create it. And the water issue was sort of part of that. And I'll go back a little bit about the history and how this happened. And I guess I should talk about my main character. It was a man named William Mulholland. And he was born in Ireland in the 1850s and ran away to sea when he was a teenager and found his way with his brother to Los Angeles in 1877, just a year after the Transcontinental Railroad arrived. And he didn't have a formal education. He had gone through, I guess, the equivalent of high school, maybe in junior high school. And he came to this small town of Los Angeles. Only a few thousand people lived there. But it had begun to grow very rapidly. And he found work as a laborer, working as a ditch digger for the city water company. And at night, he taught himself hydraulic engineering and learned from the other men who worked for the company. But basically, he was a self-taught guy. And when the city decided to build their own water system and to build this aqueduct, a engineering feat that had not ever been accomplished before, by that time, William Mulholland was so respected that he was given the job to get this done, which he did, and accomplished this. And in the process became, a huge hero in Los Angeles and a very powerful and important man in the city. But the people in the Owens Valley, which was where the watershed initially went, when the city went to acquire the land, the rights to the land, they didn't tell the people in the Owens Valley what they were up to. And the reason they didn't tell them is that, of course, if they did, they would jack the prices up and they'd never be able to buy it. So the people in the Owens Valley, said all these city slickers coming in from Los Angeles are buying up all this marginally important land for much more than it's worth. Well, boy, I'll take the profits and run. Well, it was discovered that LA was going to take the water and move it down to Los Angeles. Everybody was outraged in the Owens Valley. They said, even though the rights had been paid for, they said their water had been stolen. And it was the beginning of the Great Water Wars that went on for a century between Northern California and Los Angeles. And during those water wars, it got so bad that the activists in the Owens Valley began to dynamite the aqueduct. In fact, they dynamited it 10 times, blew it up and diverted the water in an attempt to intimidate the city into either paying them more for the land or stopping taking water from the valley. So in the midst of all this, William Mulholland, feeling now in the 1920s, another drought possibly coming up, rushes to build these dams, these new set of dams closer to the city, away from the Owens Valley, and where they could be drawn on quickly and more easily. And he decides that he's going to do concrete dams. He built 19 dams in his life, but none of them been concrete. Concrete was a new thing. And he decided that he was going to build these 2 concrete dams, and one of which was the St. Francis Dam. And it was built relatively quickly, and it held 12.4 billion gallons of water.
Very large structure.
It was 200 feet, more than 200 feet tall. It held back 12.4 billion gallons of water. It was one of the largest lakes in Southern California, the reservoir was. Also, there were power plants up above and below that supplied 90% of Los Angeles' electricity. So it was an important aspect of the city's technological underpinning. Well, as the dam was being built, there were some concerns that the dam was leaking, and there was leakage. And this is not, as Mulholland said, and engineers concurred. Concrete dams, when they begin to dry, there's cracks that develop, and these cracks can develop leaks. And so it's not unexpected. And what usually happens is that these leaks are stuffed with a thing called grout, which patches them essentially. And one morning, the dam keeper saw a particularly concerning leak that appeared to look muddy. The water looked muddy. And if the water was muddy, that could be a sign that the foundation of the dam was dissolving. So we called up Mulholland and in Los Angeles and told them, this is happening. And Mulholland said, I'll come up and take a look at it. And he came up regularly. He was always on the job. And he came up with his assistant, a man named Harvey Van Norman, and they came up and took a look. And they looked at the leak, and they looked at it, and it said it appeared to run clear to them. It became muddy as it sort of mixed with construction debris below the leak. So he declared the dam safe and drove back to Los Angeles. That same night, shortly of midnight, the dam collapsed catastrophically and released a 140-foot tall wall of water, which raced 54 miles to the Pacific Ocean. And the next day, all that remained standing was a single concrete section of the dam, which had the appropriate nickname, the Tombstone.
What did celebrated engineer missed in the end, in the final analysis, or later on as people doing more and more analysis, why he couldn't understand where the leak was coming from?
The leak turned out to be not the critical aspect of it. What, as I said before, during the rush to develop new dam technologies, and all kinds of improvements were being made. And during this time, Hoover Dam is in the process of being planned, soon to be the largest and most significant dam in the United States. So the one thing that was not common throughout the country was the active involvement of geologists in the building of dams. Everybody knew geology was important, but basically there was not an on-site geologist on most construction sites. And in the case of Mulholland, he had developed so much power and he had developed so much prestige that he didn't feel he needed to consult with anyone. And there were laws in the state of California that allowed the cities, large cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, that had their own engineering departments, to not have any state supervision, not have any outside supervision of any large projects. So essentially, Mulholland built this on his own, with no one questioning him or daring to question him. And without a lot of geological consultation, he and anyone else who was looking at the site during construction didn't notice this major geological weakness in the site, and which contributed ultimately to the failure. And that was quickly discovered afterward when geologists began to look at the ruins, and they noticed it. But because Mulholland was not to be questioned and Mulholland did what he wanted to do, the dam went ahead. So when I say that who's really to fault, well, certainly William Mulholland is to fault. He built the dam. He made the dam. But also at fault was a set of laws in California at the time that allowed these large cities to work without consultation from outside experts who might have come in and say, gee, Bill, have you considered this problem with the geology? And there was no one to do that. So essentially, most people in the United States, as of today, they don't want to get involved in all this detailed stuff. Let the experts deal with it. So there was no public urgency to have the state oversee large construction projects. Well, that had changed immediately after the St. Francis Dam. A huge new series of legislations that became the model for the United States on state and outside supervision. It was declared never again would a single man, no matter how eminent, have total control over the construction of a large project like the St. Francis Dam. So that's one of the legacies of the failure. And that's, of course, one of the causes. So it was, as in many cases, one man, certainly his errors and his inabilities caused the collapse, but it was a larger social environment. It was the pressure to grow in the city and to grow quickly that everyone wanted to do. They wanted to race ahead. And also, it was the government and the legal system in the state that allowed these kinds of projects to go without any supervision.
Not anymore, obviously.
Oh, no. That's one of the main legacies of the St. Francis Dam is the modern dam safety movement, which started in Los Angeles. Started in California.
And it started in California, right. Has this failure of St. Francis Dam has been studied by other people? Because Hoover Dam obviously has been standing there for a long time as well, and we haven't had any problems there. And I'm sure many other dam constructions are obviously looking at this, or there was no way for them to find out about these things until you put the book together.
No. It is among engineering students and people in engineering classes. There is some awareness of it, and it's sort of summarized as a geological a problem of geology. What I found particularly interesting is that, and trying to answer the question, well, why isn't this well known? And it goes right back to the beginning. From the beginning, the city of Los Angeles and the people, the business community and the governmental community of Ventura County, where most of the death and destruction took place, they were eager to get this settled, get things rebuilt, get people paid for their losses. People have lost family members to be recompensed for the losses. Nobody wanted to delay this out on endless court battles. So they agreed to settle this privately, essentially, very quickly. And the city, without taking official blame, agreed to pay. So, rather remarkable, short period of time, people got paid, houses and farms were rebuilt, and people were able to get on with their lives. In addition, because of the beginning of this new era of dam construction, which is about to begin with Hoover Dam, we were in a situation which is not unlike today. There was a huge political battle going on in the 1920s between the role of government and the role of private enterprise. And Hoover Dam represented a plan to have a number of these enormous government-sponsored water projects in the West. And there were opponents who said, no, this should be done by private enterprise. The government, that's communistic. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be doing it through capitalism. So one of the reasons the Hoover Dam was being held up was because of this battle. So when the St. Francis Dam failed, all the enemies of the government's plans would say, aha, that just shows it. No government, the city of Los Angeles, this government built this dam. They're incapable of building these long structures. It all should be done by private enterprise. So politically, this was the worst time this kind of collapse could take place. Eventually, Hoover Dam was built as a compromise between the government and private enterprise, which would be the solution. But engineers now were excited and eager to begin this new era of large-scale infrastructure, hydraulic infrastructure in the West. The last thing they wanted to do was spend time mulling around about this embarrassing failure. So they were looking to the future. So journalists, who often just love a story like this and to find the loose ends and dig around and expose this and that, they weren't getting much support. The civil engineering were moving on. The people of the valley seemed to be happy they got paid off. And then what happens on October 1929, the American stock market crashes, and we're now launched into a depression. So the story of this dam in this canyon in Southern California becomes irrelevant to what's going on nationally. And then shortly after that, what happens next? World War II. So this dam gets lost for any number of reasons. And the last reason, as I mentioned before, is historians. Now, again, that's what the job of the historian is to not forget. Well, if an historian has a kind of a view that says, oh, well, the West is about the settlement for the people that came to the East, and they came and they settled, and then you built these cities, and there was a gold rush in California, in San Francisco, and then the movie business started in Los Angeles, and that's pretty much the end of the story, so why would everyone want to talk about anything else? So it got left out of the history books as well. So it's a number of lessons that are really interesting about how history is written. Most people think, oh, gee, history is people collect all the facts and they list them and they put them in an order and they give them to you. Well, it's a narrative. You make a choice. This story belongs. This story doesn't. This story is important. This story is not important. And certainly what happened in San Francisquito Canyon or with the St. Francis Dam was not considered important, even though it was the deadliest American civil engineering failure of the 20th century. It wasn't, certainly the number of people who died in the San Francisco earthquake is greater, but that's a natural disaster. This was man-made. And yet it found itself lost, and people just weren't aware of it. And of course, that intrigued me more than anything else. As I said, here's this double mystery, a mystery of what happened, what caused this dam to collapse. And then the mystery is, why don't we know about it? And that's the heart of the book in many ways.
Mm-hmm. You know, in the chapter where you talk about quite a bit about No Time for Nightmares, and when the dam collapsed, it collapsed pretty rapidly. As you said, the 144-foot of wall high, water is traveling 54 miles. Can you describe a little bit the scope of destruction it created along the way? How many people died? How many people lost homes? And what was the final analysis that Los Angeles had to pay in dollars?
Sure. Basically, the entire 12.4 billion gallons of water that the dam held back, that reservoir drained in less than an hour. So the water was roaring through this canyon called San Francisquito Canyon, and then it opened up into what's known as the Santa Clara River Valley, which was a very productive agricultural valley, citrus and walnuts. Also, it was important because there were some oil fields there. So it was a very well off for a rural community. It was very well off. So the first people to die lived only a mile and a half below the dam. They lived at the Power Plant 2. There were 69 people who, and families, employees and their families, and who lived in a collection of cottages, and only 3 of those people survived. Again, just by total happenstance, they survived. A woman and her young boy, her child, and a neighbor, they survived. And as the water rushed down through the canyon, there were other stories of people who, you know, they didn't, it took place at midnight in total darkness. So all of a sudden they hear this roaring and rumbling, and they think maybe it's thunder, or they don't know what it is. And it gets louder, and it sounds like freight trains, but there are no freight trains in this canyon. So they open the door to look and see what it is, and there's this 140-foot tall wall of water that's totally dark, comes out of nowhere, picks them up and throws them away. And you can imagine the horror of this, because it literally, you could not see in front of you. You didn't know what it was. You just heard the noise. And the earth shaking, and your house shaking, and the glass shattering in your house. And now we have no idea what this monster sound was. And quickly they realized the dam had collapsed, because that was the only thing that's going to make that sound. But there was hardly any time to react. There was no time. So as the water rushed down through this canyon, it picked up rocks and boulders and dead animals and barbed wire. And when it emerged from the canyon, it slammed into a steel railroad bridge, just tore to pieces. Through the pieces of steel in the air, wound them up like coils, and just rumbled on. And later down, there was an encampment of workers who were working for Southern California Edison. That was the private power company in Southern California, and there were roughly 50 guys who were sleeping in tents, and they had no warning at all. And all of a sudden, there's this huge rush of water rips through their encampment. Many of the men were trapped in their tents, and they had to literally use their teeth to tear through the canvas to escape. And when they did, they were caught in this enormous whirlpool that was caused by the landscape in the area, and they were spun around until they were finally, the survivors were tossed off on the shore. And again, less than half of them survived, and the water continued to roar down. And again, there's no way to make easy warnings, because they're taking the telephone lines. The flood is taking the telephone lines with it as it goes. So by the first warning, the dam has collapsed around midnight. The first warnings start to arrive by 1 o'clock, because they figured a way to reroute the telephone lines to get away from the lines in the canyon. So here are these women telephone operators in their rural towns, passing on the word that a flood is coming, not knowing when the flood's going to come and wipe them off the canyon floor as well. And a number of them were considered heroes for doing that. Another man was a highway patrolman who got a message, and he began again roaring through the night with his motorcycle, because in those days, not everybody had a telephone. In fact, most people didn't. So he with his siren, he would shout and roar through the streets to warn people. And of course, they didn't know what it was. They, it's a flood, it's a flood. Well, I mean, we've had floods before, a couple of feet of water, and no one knew how big it was going to be. And meanwhile, it had torn through bridges and ripped up the highways and rail lines, and it was coming, and again, in a way that no one knew what it was. And when it hit, it was always a total surprise. So 54 miles later, it finally oozes into the Pacific Ocean and leaves this long, what I call flood path of destruction, causing millions of dollars of damage and taking an estimated almost 500 people, certainly well over 450 people died. And we don't really know the final count, because what was happening is that the mud was so thick that many bodies may still be buried there. And many people were just passing through. They didn't live in the community. Many of them were farm workers who entire families were wiped out, so no one even knew they were missing. So it was devastating. And when the dawn came up the next morning, it was just like hell.
Certainly a man-made disaster of one of the largest scopes in the country. The scope was so large, considering the available technology at that time, with no communications and not sophisticated equipment as we have today. It must be very difficult to communicate and then work on cleaning up and saving as many lives as you can.
Well, I mean, there were just, the survivors are so few. As I think I quote one of the nurses who said that, you either you survived or you died, and most people died. There's one story where they went the next morning to search for bodies, to find bodies, and they went down the stream bed, and they found fingers sticking up out of the mud. And when they dug down, they found that the body was standing straight up and down, and it was under 6 feet of mud.
Wow. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. You've been dealing with this fascinating topic in the book, and a very meticulous and research-based process that you have in putting it together. How did you get interested in writing a book, and how your career developed in the last 10, 20 years?
Well, I have written books before. As I started to tell you, when I was in New York, what I started to do is I started my career as a documentary filmmaker, and I worked at CBS in New York for a series called The 20th Century, which was hosted by Walter Cronkite. And I began as a researcher there and really honed my skills, which is really the essence of documentary filmmaking and the essence of nonfiction book writing, and enjoyed the process and learned to research, and eventually became a writer at CBS. And then I became a director, and then I produced my own show before I left CBS and came to Los Angeles. So I've always been interested really in nonfiction materials and historical materials, starting with my first job at CBS. And so when I came here, by that time I'd worked on a series about a history of Black America, and I wrote a book on that. And then when I came to Los Angeles, as I said, I became fascinated with the history of Los Angeles, and I began doing a series of documentaries about Los Angeles. And then eventually I wrote a history of Los Angeles called Picturing Los Angeles. It's an illustrated narrative history of the city, pretty much the only one that's out there. And so I had been done books in New York, and then I did books here, but mainly I was a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. But more and more my subject matter was Los Angeles. And fairly recently, I completed a 7-hour series on the history of American movies, which is very much a Los Angeles story. And it was shown on Turner Classic Movies. And that again was history and another aspect of Los Angeles. So the filmmaking, the documentary process, the research process has always been really what intrigues me. And of course, the key to this kind of work in documentaries is that really you're allowed to follow your curiosity more than you would normal in other jobs. Of course, you got to get somebody to pay for it. And that's always a struggle. But, if you find an idea, whether, it's the history of the movies, or it's a history of a dam collapse, or it's a history of the harbor of Los Angeles, or it's a history I did a documentary on the history of Latino Chicano rock and roll in East Los Angeles, a history about music. Your mind can, wherever you can go and find out about it, you get somebody to agree to put up the funds for it, you can explore endlessly and follow your curiosity. And to me, that's really what's exciting about not only being a documentary filmmaker, but also doing, working on books as well, nonfiction books.
Are you working on any other projects that you can share with our listeners?
I can't talk about it. I'm working about a book idea that actually takes place in Los Angeles in the 1930s. I'm working on that now. Also, for the fun of it, I often, in the last, few years, always as a traveler, but in the last few years, I've been making documentaries about my travels. So full PBS documentaries with music and narration and all kinds of stuff. And so I did a film about China. I did a film about Turkey. I'm in the midst now of doing a really fascinating film. I drove the full length of the Mississippi River from northern Minnesota to New Orleans. It took me almost a month. And really, I'm making a film about really this heart of American culture, musically. Of course, the Civil War took place along the river. It's sort of the heart of American culture. And also, it's the way I'm working is a way that is so different about how documentaries are made today when they were made when I was starting out. The equipment's different. It's easier to do. And so it's a kind of an essay on documentary history. It's an essay on the river as importance in America, American music and jazz and blues, and the importance of the environment, because of course the river is this classic engineering feat of trying to control the Mississippi River, which goes back, to the 1930s when people were starting about the St. Francis Dam. So it's environmental, it's technical, it's musical, it's historical, it's political, it's, all those things. And, that's the kind of thing that makes it fun for me.
Exciting. You do live exciting life because you do have exciting projects to always focus on.
Yeah, well, if over the years you develop the skills. I mean, when I started out working in documentaries, the equipment weighed a ton. And, you had a crew of 5 or 6 people and the equipment cost a fortune and, no one could afford it. And it's all changed. People are shooting their films on videos on their iPhones. And looking perfectly fine. They can edit on their own home computers. And when I was starting out making documentaries, an editing system cost tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's a different era, and that's one of the things I talk about in the film about the Mississippi. And then when I finished the Mississippi film, I was in India for a month in November. I'll be doing a film about India.
Oh, very nice. We have been speaking with John Wilkman, the author of Floodpath, the deadliest man-made disaster of 20th century America and the making of modern Los Angeles. Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and we will be delighted to have you again if you have another book coming in the near future.
Terrific. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.